If you look through collections of Christian apologetics, you'll find people claiming that Christianity ended slavery and Christianity is responsible for the scientific revolution. Whenever there's a moral or scientific advancement, you'll find some Christian or other religious group there somewhere claiming that was their God and his followers who actually were responsible for it. So it's actually on the contrary. Believing God to be on their side, Christian sects have fought tooth and nail against progress when it contradicted their holy scriptures or dogma, only to claim after losing the battle that they were the forefront of those advancements all along. Okay, I have to confess that I've already watched a portion of this evening's talk. It was a little video clip, and it got me up in arms almost immediately. I was kind of, mumbling and grumbling at the screen. So I'm really been looking forward to this evening's presentation, eagerly anticipating it. Our presenter, Pat Morrow, is our secret weapon and one of our greatest treasures. He's currently our vice president, but he's done his greatest work for us, I think, in his outreach efforts. Because of him, we now have 2 other humanist atheist groups that have formed here in southern Manitoba, and we have contacts across Canada. Pat can man an outreach booth like nobody's business. He can cite Bible verses, and more importantly, he can keep his cool and his patience for hours while refuting some of the wildest religious claims. He's also a great and humble guy. So please join me in welcoming our speaker for this evening, Pat Morrow.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to run a video almost right away before we get to talking about the subject of stealing reason, I think it's probably good to have a base of what the apologetics is saying. I know it's not a lot for our community to just keep watching apologetics videos. It's something I do, but I realize that it's probably not palatable to everybody. So I thought I would run this video, and then we'll get into the presentation of stealing reason.
It's probably a mistake to assume that modern science was born out of a reaction against medieval Christianity. The matter of fact is that most of the architects of modern science were indebted to medieval Christianity, first for their own faith, and most of them were churchmen. Copernicus was the recipient of one of the best educations that medieval Europe had to offer, and he was a church administrator working in a cathedral. And in his spare time, he did astronomical work. Johannes Kepler had thought that he would become a minister, and when it didn't work out for him to become ordained as a Lutheran minister, he finally wrote that he believed that he could glorify God through his astronomical work and reveal to the world truths that were revealed in some ways through the divine possibility of getting good data about the heavenly motions. Isaac Newton himself, who wrote more on theology than he did on science. If we stack up his theological works next to his scientific works, the theological ones, especially on Old Testament prophecy, would dwarf the new ones. Somehow the idea that belief in the God of the Bible was something that the architects of modern science were seeking to escape simply doesn't bear out the historic realities.
And all of the founding fathers of science who first got the scientific method going, they were all Christians. Why? Because they believed in a God who was rational and coherent, and who had created a world that was rational and coherent and logical, and therefore you could investigate it expecting to find pattern and order.
Richard referred to the very important fact that science, modern science as we know it, exploded in the 16th and 17th centuries, and it arose out of a theistic background. And many philosophers of science have studied this and come to the conclusion that's now called Whitehead's thesis, that human beings became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. I think that is profoundly important, because it means, far from religion hindering science, it was the driving force behind the rise of science in the first place. And when Isaac Newton, for example, discovered his law of gravity and wrote down the equations of motion, he didn't say, marvelous, I now understand it, I've got a mechanism, therefore I don't need God. In fact, it was the exact opposite. it was because he understood the complexity and sophistication of the mathematical description of the universe that his praise for God was increased.
Isaac Newton, physicist, co-discoverer of calculus, considered by many to be the greatest scientist in history. Your laws of universal gravitation and motion provided the grand synthesis that concluded the scientific revolution. Tell us what you think of atheism. Newton's response: atheism is so senseless and odious to mankind that it never had many professors. You seeing a pattern? The scientists of the scientific revolution would roll over in their graves if they heard a bunch of 18-year-old atheists claiming to be champions of science just because they follow Richard Dawkins on Twitter. So why were Christians the pioneers of the scientific revolution? Here, our atheist friends often insist that it was just dumb luck. Anyone could have done it. And if Europe had been filled with atheists, it would have happened even faster. But this is sheer nonsense. There were cultures and civilizations around the world. Plenty of people had the opportunity to study astronomy and physics and chemistry and biology. But these branches of science all took off at roughly the same time in one particular civilization. It only makes sense that we should ask, why? The problem is that when we ask the people who did it, why, they immediately start talking about their belief that the universe was created by a rational being, and that since human beings were created in the image of this rational being, we can understand the universe, and that by setting out to understand it, we're worshiping God. As for atheists thinking that they could have come up with science without Christians doing it for them, let's take a quick trip to planet reality. Atheists would have been the last people to ever start a scientific revolution. Why is that? Well, anyone can do science now, because we all accept the scientific hypothesis. We all believe that the universe can be understood, that we are the kinds of things that can understand it, and that it's good for us to understand it. But the pioneers of the scientific revolution already believed these things before they set out to prove them. They believed them based on their theology.
If you were to make a list of the 200 greatest scientists of all time, from Newton, Copernicus, Kepler, Pascal, Gassendi, Boyle, the list goes on, you find that the vast majority of them were religious believers. Moreover, it's not an accident that science did not develop universally. It developed in Western civilization. Why is that? Because in Western civilization, there is an embedded religious idea, and that is the idea of the rational cosmos. The Muslim philosopher Al-Ghazali denies that the universe operates by laws. He says everything happens because Allah wills it at every given moment. That's why science didn't develop in the Muslim world. It's the sense of the whimsical, the miraculous universe. The point I'm trying to get at here is that on the basis of, I would say, a 1% minority of religious rednecks, we have an indictment of all the world's religions as a whole. Nothing could be more crude and shameful than to imply that Athens and Jerusalem, which have given rise to Western civilization, that have shaped our philosophy, our economy, separation of powers, checks and balances, when Thomas Jefferson, who was
Dinesh, I want to cut you off to let Anthony Graham.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, there are two things, Dinesh. With great respect to you, you are the most tremendous rewriter of history I've ever come across in my life.
If you get a chance to watch that whole debate, it is flippin' hilarious. Anthony Grayling's partner in that debate is actually the great-grandson of Charles Darwin. So it's actually a wonderful debate to watch, even though it's Dinesh D'Souza. There's the title, which I'll skip now. When we saw the video, the claims of our Christian apologists, I tried to select not outlandish Christian apologists. These are sort of the run-of-the-mill, the popular ones, the ones that gets the debates and get the shows. Because there's some really crazy stuff out there when you go looking. Our first apologist, Mark Kathoff, says probably a mistake to assume modern science was born out of a reaction against medieval Christianity. Andy Bannister goes on, the founding fathers of science were all Christian. Science is possible because humans expect laws in nature and given by a natural lawgiver, Of course, he means the Christian God, and in John Lennox's case, the Catholic Christian God. Religion was the driving force behind the rise of science, and of course, the ever-famous science developed in Western civilization. I say horse hockey to a lot of them, and we'll have a look, because as we peel back the layers, as we go a little deeper into looking at more than just the surface layers of the argument, we'll find the truth is very much different. David Wood, conveniently, because we can understand the universe, we are worshiping God. Well, that pretty much covers everything in one fell swoop, and not a lick of evidence for any of it. One of the things he says is the universe can be understood, we can understand it, and it is good to understand it. It's a little bit of playing with words there, because the universe is everything, and since the universe is everything that we know of, what he's really saying is the basics of science for every human being who has taken up the endeavor. Learning is possible, we can learn, and it's good to learn. And we've been doing that since long before there was even Homo sapiens. Even early hominids would teach their others that, obsidian was a sharper edge than flint, but flint held a better edge. And although this is not science, this is the business of learning and making things gradually better. It's not a divine truth. How we learn is a completely natural one. Without it, our species would be extinct. Science comes not from an ideology or a religion, but derives from natural human curiosity, as we'll soon show here. But it does beg the question, when did science begin? When can we actually call something science? Experiencing the world, using data and empirical methods to find out what is the truth. And we have a date for that. May 28th, 585 BC, about 613, in Turkey. It's local Greek time, but in Turkey. And I'd like to introduce, if you don't know him already from your university philosophy classes, this is Thales of Miletus. And a very long time ago in 585, he used empirical data and basically the tools of science to predict the time and date of eclipse in 585. And we know that because we can actually take his empirical data and do the math today and find out that yes, there was an eclipse in 585. Thales rejected the use of mythology to explain the world and the universe, instead explaining natural objects by phenomena, by theories and hypotheses, in a precursor to what we would call modern science. Socrates wrote a really interesting anecdote for Thales of Miletus. There was a certain time where he again used data and even talking to farmers, empirical evidence, to find out that the olive crop was going to look like a good olive crop. So what he did is he reserved all the olive presses in Miletus. And when it came time to press the olives, well, they had to rent off Thales if they wanted to get their oils made. He made a great deal of money about this, but he showed that knowledge is power. It is economy. It is economics. And although it's an anecdote of antiquity, we really can't say that it's true. It is interesting that what makes him so darn important is the things that he believed, whether it was the eclipse of the eclipse of the sun or the moon, or sometimes he also believed that everything was made of water, and earthquakes were the result of waves crashing to the shore. But he did introduce the idea that is science today, and that all of what he believed was falsifiable. Not revelation from God and not wish thinking. There was many more great scientists to come. Thales of Miletus. There was Anaximander. Geez, you know I practiced that and now I can't say it. These were scientists, but at that time we did not call it science as we do now. They were natural philosophers, and that term was used probably all the way till the 17th and 18th century. The difference between a scientist and a natural philosopher is some natural philosophers use testing and empirical evidence to prove their truths in mathematics or in astronomy, whereas other natural philosophers will do it using pure thought. And in Greek times, we had the natural philosophers like Epicurus, who was an atomist, and just by pure thought, they divined that, divined is probably the wrong word, but that the smallest particle of matter is an atom, and that's why we call them atoms today. The smallest particle of an element is an atom. We know of much smaller particles now. Everybody probably heard of Euclid, the Euclid axiomatic geometry. Eratosthenes, he was a scientist in his own right who figured out the circumference of the Earth just by measurement, just by measuring the distance of shadow in two different places on the Earth, and he was able to come back with an estimate of about 40,000 kilometers, which wasn't too far off for a man who actually never left Athens. But even in ancient Greece, the great thinkers were not immune to religious persecution. Anaxagoras was at least allegedly persecuted by the Athenians for blasphemy, for simply theorizing the sun was a hot stone. Other pagans tried to launch blasphemy prosecutions against Aristarchus when he claimed the earth revolved around the sun. Sound familiar? Socrates, of course, was found guilty of both corrupting the minds of the youth and impiety, not believing in the gods of the state. And he had to drink poison, or was forced to drink poison. Another scientist that is still continuing today to surprise us is Archimedes of Syracuse. And if you haven't heard of Archimedes, this is the prairies. You've seen his work. Every grain auger was invented by Archimedes, and it is the Archimedes screw, how it winds the grain up into the bins. That's an Archimedes screw. His body of work spans thousands of inventions and mathematical truths. What is really amazing about this is the Archimedes palimpsest. A palimpsest is a book that has been written over. And Archimedes' palimpsest was sort of rediscovered. Well, we knew about it all through history, that it was first copied in about 900, and it's about 174 pages long, and it had theories and mathematical calculations. And what happened to it is what they think is in 1204, Constantinople was sacked by the Roman Catholic Christians over the Eastern Orthodox Christians, and that was brought back to Northern Europe, that book. After coming back to Northern Europe, it was quickly taken apart, washed, the math and figures were cleaned off of it, and it became a Christian prayer book. And before you go, oh, those damn Christians, they probably didn't know what they had. By this time in Western Christianity, they lost the ability to read the ancient Greek, and so they had no ideas what they had. It was bought at auction just in the 1980s, I believe it was, by millionaire Rick Adams. Rick Adams made his money in software development, and he's actually, you probably haven't heard of him. However, you probably heard of the James Randi $1 million challenge to give $1 million to everybody. Yeah, he's the $1 million. Rick Adams is the guy who put up the money. And of course, when a skeptic gets a hold of it, science got a hold of it. And the amazing thing of the Archimedes palimpsest is that many of the mathematical problems, after they use different scientific techniques to read through the prayers and read through all the pictures and bring out this book that Archimedes wrote so many hundreds of years ago, they found that many of the mathematical problems solved by the development of Newton's calculus 17 centuries later had already been solved by this guy. Differently, it wasn't Newton's calculus in Archimedes' book. He went about it a different way, but he got relatively the same results on a lot of Newton's work, mathematical work. We also had medical things. With the discovery of Pompeii, I'm sure many people know what this is. Don't know? No, most of the women maybe know. Okay, this is a vaginal speculum. Of course, it would be looking up things that only doctors should be looking up. It is bronze, and it's the most uncomfortable looking thing I've ever seen. But they were doing medicine like
the modern ones are almost exactly the same.
Yeah.
I know you can recognize it.
Yeah. Well, when I was looking at this, I was looking at it says 20.6 centimeters. So the thing is about this. So that's probably about 15 centimeters. And if you dialed it right open, anyways, and it really was like, holy cow, till I saw this one. This is from Pompeii as well. This is a male catheter made out of bronze. I can't imagine it's that flexible, but if you really had to go and you weren't able to, I could see the relief it would bring, but the workmanship in making things like this is far beyond what we thought the Greeks and the Romans could do. And in one of Richard Carrier, who did his PhD study on ancient Greek and Roman science, tells of a story of actually one item they found, and it was a bronze, very thin bronze tube, and inside the bronze tube was a needle. And they were actually able to find the writings for what this was for. And what it was for, this bronze tube, the needle would be inserted in the tube, and then it would be pushed into a cataract under the lens. And then the physician would pull the needle out, suck out the cataract, and it would be left to heal naturally. I don't know what the success of this operation was, but such fine instruments of bronze, again, tells us so much more about the science. We also had computers back then. I'm sure somebody has heard of the Antikythera mechanism. Yeah. The Antikythera mechanism was discovered by sponge divers in about 1906. And for many years, we really didn't know what we had. But of course, again, modern science using X-rays and all kinds of different thermal scans and light refraction techniques, we were able to discover all the writing and exactly what it did, and some of the things that it might have been possible to do, but we can't infer that from what we found. But the Antikythera mechanism could tell the ancient Romans the phases of the moon, and by that the tides, the moon's in irregular elliptical orbit. It could keep track of 4 Roman calendars, predict both solar and lunar eclipses out to 250 years, track the positions of the 5 known planets and the sun through the zodiac. And the very last thing they discovered on it was something that was purely cultural. It tracked the 4-year cycle of the Olympic Games, which kind of tells you how important the Olympic Games and that part of the culture was to the ancient Greeks and Romans. But Greece and Rome fell. The scholarly estimates to what we lost of their science and their history is somewhere around 90%. But to really understand this, when we look at the history, science was going a lot longer, long before Christianity. And for a Christian apologist to say that science started with Christianity is just willful ignorance. They're closing their eyes to a great deal of human history. Of course, right after, not necessarily right after, but we have the birth of Christianity. This was a combination of course, pardon me, Zoroastrian and Eastern Oriental beliefs, and Jewish beliefs, of course. There was really a small religious persecuted cult for 100 or 200 years. It had no clearly defined dogma. In the beginning, it was even up for grabs if Jesus was divine. Some believe he was, some believe he didn't. The Trinity was not actually clearly defined till the 2nd century. Despite Christianity and its absurd ideas, they were really overlooked because Christianity could sell. It offered people at that time, when the empire is collapsing, it offered life after death. It was popular with women, the disenfranchised, the lepers. You got to remember, Jesus hung out with all these people, with common fishermen, prostitutes. He cured the sick. In the street, he was a real god of the people. In 311, the Roman Emperor Galerius they issued an edict of toleration and said that let Christianity be like any other religion in the Roman Empire. A few years later, of course, it became the official religion, and in less than a century, it was the only religion. We move into the Dark Ages, and the Dark Ages are marked by, of course, political disintegration, economic depression, that goes on with political disintegration. And anybody who has witnessed the problems in Syria knows what happens when you have a civil war that only lasts a few years. When Christianity started getting going in the 3rd century, this was at a time where there was almost 50 years of constant civil war in the Roman Empire. So it found fertile fields of which this religion could grow. But of course, correlation is not causation. Christianity did not cause the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages were a combination of many elements. Richard Carrier puts it this way of Christianity's effect on the Dark Ages. As far as the Dark Ages, it is that Christianity didn't do any good. It neither corrected what had gone wrong nor reintroduced any striving for the dreams and aspirations of earlier Greek and Roman idealists. But to the contrary, Christianity embraced a partial and sometimes full retreat from them. Hence, Christianity did not kill science, but it made no effort to rescue and revive its ideals. It was instead let them drown with little sign of regret, and in some cases even to praise its demise. Thus, Christianity was bad for science. It put a stop to scientific progress for almost 1,000 years, and even after that made science recovery difficult, painful, and slow. So Christianity gets its start in the 3rd century. We have the apologists saying that starting the scientific revolution in about 1500, we have, 1,500 years of a cultural norm, and at some point in time, why would it actually, after 1,500 years of a cultural norm, all of a sudden start a scientific revolution? There must be a lot more to it. And Charles Freeman from the New Humanist magazine sums up the way natural philosophers looked at the natural world at that time. And in the Middle Ages saw the world as a creation of God and a material world only as part of a wider cosmos, which is the subject of mass and supernatural forces. Not only the actions of a God through his miracles, but angels, saints, and devils. This meant that much debate about these supernatural forces and what God could actually do or not do. There was very little interest in systematically collecting information about the material world as intensely and curiously as the Greeks did. In other words, early Christianity, they were just not interested. So something else must have happened here to spark the scientific revolution. It couldn't have been just Christianity. It's important to note that science didn't stop. This is probably a graph you may have seen on the internet. It is not a scientific graph, but it does show you a comparison of what went on at about that time. You'll notice that the scientific storehouse of Greek knowledge went to the time of place what we call the Islamic Golden Age. It found a home in the Caliphate of Cordoba, Spain, in places like Islamic Sicily. One of the fathers of the scientific, what we call the scientific method, is Al-Hazan. A quote from one of his writings, he wrote 200 and some odd books on astronomy, theology, and mathematics. And he writes, "The duty of a man who investigates the writings of scholars, if learning the truth is his goal, is to make himself an enemy of everything that he reads and attack it from every side. He should also suspect himself as he performs his critical examination of it, so that he may avoid falling into other prejudice or leniency. In other words, you really have to check your biases. You really have to let the evidence lead you where you go. And it forms the basis of the scientific method. Commonly in North American society, we give the birth of the scientific method to Roger Bacon, some 250 years later. But in my research, this man had it. Scientists were using it, portions of the scientific method all through history, but this man had it quite a bit earlier. And he is influenced, he is noted in Da Vinci's work, in Christopher Huygens' work, and in Descartes' work that we find later in the Middle Ages. But of course, the Golden Age of Islam came to an end, unfortunately, with Mongol invasions and even more war. And of course, the rise of what Dinesh D'Souza referred to as Al-Ghazali, the Islamic philosopher. And Al-Ghazali is famous for actually changing Islam from a less open society to more what we see today. He did things like he made the practice of manipulating numbers haram or illegal. Of course, in the Middle Ages, we have, this is from Quill and Ink History on YouTube, and you'll often have Christian apologists, and they say, yes, we did have our scientists. And you could give John Philoponus the title of natural philosopher or science of his time. And in this apologetic-like video, one of the greatest natural philosophers of his time. I think that's a little bit of hyperbole, but it's interesting to notice that he came up with the idea of impetus, of what we now know as inertia. When you throw a ball through the air, why does it keep going? And whenever we go through the apologetic literature, this seems to be the man that comes up, him and Origen. But as one scholar put it, if you find one cat juggler in 1,000 years, it does not mean that religion supported cat juggling. And it is a double-edged sword for Christian apologists, because Origen, the philosopher earlier who tried to bring in the Greek ideas, and John Philoponus were both condemned as heretics. So I don't know how a religion can claim that these are one of theirs and they were also a heretic. He's also mentioned quite a bit in Galileo's work, but the church really killed any prospect for science under its watch for nearly 1,000 years. We won't see science remotely practiced like John Philoponus till 1250, 1300. Of course, today it's very popular with many apologists. The books out today, Stanley A. Jackie, The Savior of Science, and Rodney Stark. These are basically, Jesus is responsible for everything. He gives us, and I mean everything, modern democracies, our democratic systems, our economic systems, it's all Jesus. The ones on the top by James Hahnemann, God's Philosophers and the Genesis of Science, are the same book, but they were marketed differently. One for Europe, God's Philosophers, and one for North American market. It's an interesting book. It was shortlisted for the Royal Society Prize of Science books, but nobody was clear why. It was primarily concerned with with Christian science in the period of 1200 to 1450, and really, as one commentator put it, really only makes sense if read from the Catholic perspective. What I found interesting about the book, it attempts to show that Christianity was doing science throughout the Middle Ages, and it would one of James Hahnemann's things is to talk about all the many inventions of the Middle Ages, and he talks about crop rotation, the heavy plow, the mechanical clock, horse stirrups and the horse collar. And I was going through all these inventions. Well, Yes, Christians of the Middle Ages made some improvements. There was no direct intervention of the church on any of these, and they're all somebody else's inventions. Crop rotation came from the Romans. The heavy plow was also Roman, but adapted to our northern soils in Europe. The mechanical clock comes from the Chinese. And the Greeks inventing it probably at the same time, but not knowing what each other was doing. Horse stirrups, again, Mongols and Chinese, and the horse collar was Roman. These books are interesting if you close one eye and if you close one eye and really try to think like a believer, you can see where they would make sense. And if you find them in the bargain bin at the hospital book market, I'd say pick them up. They'd be interesting. I have God's Philosophers, but I don't have the other two because they were just too way out there. Biggest thing that changes is the rediscovery of Greek philosophy. This is where science really starts to get going, where we rediscover it. But Aristotle didn't believe in the divine intervention. He was a determinist. He believed that knowledge was gained by observation and reasoning, which sounds like a lot like science. Thomas Aquinas took those ideas and did his best to make Aristotle's ideas jive with Christian theology to some success. He got a lot of stuff to fit Christian theology and bring these good and new ideas in. And they slowly began working themselves into the schools and the universities of the time. But this took a very long time. You got to remember, books were hand-scribed and information traveled at a snail's pace. Of course, he accepted a lot of the teachings and agreed with Aristotle on many things, and one of them was that slavery is natural. With Aquinas, slavery was due to the problem of sin. With Aristotle, people were natural-born slaves. If he knew about genetics, he would say genetically predisposed to be beasts of burden. But he was able to match those two, which is really strange, because when we look through Christian history, Christians were actually quite anti-slavery, even after it became the official religion. St. Augustine speaks of granting freedom to slaves as a great religious virtue and declares that Christian law against regarding God's rational creation as property. Not 200 years later, we have Pope Gregory dispatching a priest to get slaves from pagan Britain. And so we see a real flip-flop in the church, and that continued for quite a long time. This is 1866. This is Pope Pius IX. Slavery itself is considered such an essential nature and not contrary to the natural or divine law. There can be several just titles of slavery, and they are referred to by approved theologians and commentators of the sacred canons. It is not contrary to the natural and divine law for a slave to be sold, bought, exchanged, or given. This is June 1866, 100 years before I was born, just 100 years ago. However, Christian, of course, with the Christian apologists, they won't talk about the Pope. They'll talk about this man. This man's William Wilberforce. And he led the push to stop slavery in the British Empire. And he was successful. Just a few days before he passed away, they were successful of abolishing slavery in the British Empire. So we owe him a deal of thanks for that. But he says, if to be freely alive to the sufferings of my fellow creatures is to be a fanatic, I am one of the most incurable fanatics ever permitted to be at large. William Wilberforce. A very humanist sentiment in my ideas. It shows that his natural human empathy was stronger than his religious bigotry. His tribe expanded to include all human beings, not just Christians. He was beginning to see the world the way more modern people do, as to use the term, all men are brothers. Of course, the Bible being what it is, we have Ebenezer L. Warren in 1864, in the 1860s. This is a bestseller called Nellie Norton. And what it does is it takes the anti-slavery arguments of the abolitionists and offers a biblical refutation of pretty much everything they're putting out there. This book is actually available on Gutenberg Press for free if you ever want to download the ebook. And it follows Nellie Norton going through the South, and basically every situation they come across, they have a Bible verse that shows that slavery is perfectly allowable. There's also another book, it's called Slavery Ordained by God from 1857, and it's by Reverend Frederick Augustus Ross. And these were all books using the same book that everybody reads, the Bible, to argue different points. The truth is that the values of empathy, compassion, sense of fairness, that ended slavery in many cultures was not due to Christianity, it was due to people discovering their humanity. Throughout history, humans have been trying to end slavery since there were societies. In the 3rd century in India, and it goes on today. Christianity ending slavery was just a microcosm of the moral advancement that humans have been doing ever since the beginning of time, or at least the 3rd century BC. Slavery is still not abolished. It still goes on today. There are thousands of people in slavery, in sexual servitude and human trafficking, and it's a problem we're still working on. But it is not a problem that has been solved by Christianity. Another thing that would happened to stimulate the scientific revolution was, of course, the Black Death. Another thing you don't hear apologists talk about much at all. During its height from 1348 to 1350, the clergy, 40 to 60% of the clergy was virtually wiped out. There was a higher mortality rate amongst the clergy because they would visit sick people. They would give last rites. The ones that actually didn't take off to safer places were usually succumbed to the illness. McLaurie H. Zenther in The Black Death, on her thesis of the Black Death, and its impact on church and popular religions, says Europeans do not experience a decline in their faith in God, but rather a decline in their confidence and ability in the institution of the church. In places like Barcelona, the deaths of priests reached almost 60% between 1348 and 49. This, of course, ended the church's monopoly because it had an inability to counter heretical ideas. And Philip Ziegler in The Black Death wrote, "The abrupt disappearance of nearly half the clergy, including a disproportionately great number of the brave and diligent, inevitably put a heavy strain on the machinery of the church and reduced its capacity to deal effectively with movements of protest or revolt." So with the reintroduction of Greek philosophy and the weakening of the church, things were really actually ripe for a change. And that change was coming. For hundreds of years, there have been great thinkers, geniuses even, but they were often separated by thousands of years, or hundreds of years and thousands of miles, and they needed a way to communicate. And that was about to be solved in the third thing that made the scientific revolution possible, and that was, of course, Johannes Gutenberg's invention of the printing press. And I know we've probably taken this all in high school, and everybody says, the printing press, printing press, that's what did it. But I don't think they fully realize the effect. The printing press, of course, was not a Christian invention, of course, and just so James Hahnemann knows, yes, it was put together by a Christian, but the block lettering and movable type is a Chinese and Korean idea. And the press technology would come from olive, fir, and paper presses that were used in Europe at the time. And one of these things, a two-man team, even with the Gutenberg press, could press 3,000 pages in a day, in a 15-hour day. So Gutenberg's idea, or Gutenberg's press, caught on like wildfire. And at first it was used primarily for Bibles. But when you can start printing books and ideas, humans have a way of making things like that take off. As George Dyson said, knowledge began to freely replicating and assumed a life of its own. And just to show you, I was trying to look for a graph to show you what kind of an impact this had, and this is the best I could do. This is the output of printed books. This is the roughly the end of this century here is the beginning of the printing press. And it takes off 2 million copies, 4 million copies, 6 million copies by the 18th century. But that's not the only thing that changes. Output of manuscripts, of new ideas, of books, of papers, and often papers that were contrary to church doctrine, take off as well too. And sorry, I don't have the numbers that keep going, but by the 15th century, just after the inventing of the printing press, there are 5 million new manuscripts, and those are turning into millions of books. So the new ideas are really flowing, and as they flow, we get closer to a scientific revolution. After the printing press, it was the fire that helped launch the scientific revolution in 1543. We see a dramatic rise in literacy, a widespread dissemination of knowledge and new ideas, spread of criticism and authority, and finally we get to the scientific revolution, but not quite. We also have to throw in the age of discovery. Humans started traveling the globe. They started bringing back all these new ideas to Europe, and we had the printing press, developing all these new ideas and getting these ideas out. Of course, with the fall of Constantinople in 1543, this is the later fall of Constantinople. That town was invaded so many times by at the time, the Moors, but the Ottoman Empire, the Muslims. That brought the Christians of the Byzantine Empire north, bringing all those new books and Greek manuscripts and new ideas into Europe, further filling the minds of the people in Europe, to a Europe that is already experiencing a weakened church. So what we have, instead of Christianity started the scientific revolution, we have Greek knowledge comes back to Europe in the 1200s, the Black Death weakening the church, and the beginnings of Renaissance humanism. Those new Greek ideas are becoming to be discovered. Invention of the printing press, the fall of Constantinople bringing more ideas, the age of discovery bringing even more ideas, and finally, in 1500, the scientific revolution begins. It was a paradigm shift away from spiritualism and the imaginary toward a natural reality, one that we can demonstrate through reason. And so why there's no scientific revolutions there? They simply did not have, religion is not enough to promote science. You need all those other effects that we just spoke about. We turned away from the old way to look inward for answers, which was poor progress, to the new way to look outward for answers. I always got to get Star Trek in there. I just wanted to just very quickly go back to the Greeks, because I don't think people understand the influence of bringing back the Greek culture, what it had to do to the Renaissance and to the scientific revolution. Because seeing is believing. And when you see, art has always had a special relationship with science. And when we look with our modern eyes, we can tell what came before and what came after. It's pretty natural. So when we look at the ancient Greek works and the beautiful carvings and how they cast light and shadow and how we can actually see these are real people, how everything is done in proportion, anatomically, mathematically correct. It would be easy enough to, like Aphrodite, to picture her as a real person. Contrast that with medieval Christian, what we find 1,000 years later. Art doesn't seem to improve. It actually seems to go backwards, just like our technology did. Notice how there's no light, no shadow. Everything has seemed to be improportional, cartoonish, some say. And although these are ancient works of human history from the Middle Ages, one can't help think, where our minds were at, what we were thinking of. This one, for some reason, just takes me as a slightly middle-aged spread Jesus with almost Buddha-like. I don't know. But again, proportions, no light, no shadow. Then we get into the Renaissance, the Humanist Renaissance, and we can see that we have there's no more halos. Everything is much more reality pictures with the light, the shadow, the definition. We've kind of stepped away from fantasy. We see this in various art pictures of the Renaissance. One important thing about the Renaissance is that as it went further and as the church got less powerful with various schisms in that, art, you saw a lot more landscapes, you saw a lot more secular themed ideas. By the end of the Renaissance, as the church lost influence, art became more secular, very different, and it actually is taking on more of the realism of what we found in the Greek and Roman art. But what about those scientists that apologists like to quote all the time? I'm just going to go through a couple of quotes there. Those who study the stars have God for a teacher. Tycho Brahe. Brahe was, of course, a Danish nobleman. Our piety is deeper and the greater is our awareness of creation and its grandeur. Since we astronomers are the priests of the highest God in regard to the book of nature, it befits us to be thoughtful not to the glory of our minds, but rather above all else the glory of God. Of course, Kepler was the imperial mathematician to Rudolf II, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and his grandfather was the Lord Mayor of Wilderstadt. René Descartes, I see plainly that certainty and truth of knowledge depends uniquely on my awareness of the one true God, so such to an extent that I was incapable of perfect knowledge about anything until I became aware of him. Descartes' father was a member of Parliament. And of course, the man who started the scientific revolution at the very beginning, to know the mighty works of God, to comprehend his wisdom and majesty and power, is to appreciate the degree and wonderful workings of his laws. Surely this must be pleasing and acceptable mode of worship to the Most High, to whom ignorance cannot be more gratifying than knowledge. I do have a problem with this because it's in direct contradiction with the Bible. The Bible, of course, penalizes us from taking from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And it also tells us in Proverbs to trust in the Lord with all your heart and not lean on your own understanding. It would seem to me that the God of the Bible would find ignorance more gratifying than knowledge. But that's just me. And I think you'll notice as I went through all those, I have where they came from, what their parents did. You'll notice these are all men of very privileged positions. At that time, near the end of the beginning of the scientific revolution and the end of the Middle Ages, was a time known as the crisis of the late Middle Ages, where the Black Death had taken many. It had wrecked economies. There were multiple wars, the War of the Roses, and infighting in Germany. So they were very much stuck between a rock and a hard place. Any aristocrat that wanted to maintain their position has to suck up to the church, because the church has to make sure that the peasants stay in line. Like in Germany, in between 1336 and 1525, they witnessed no fewer than 60 instances of militant peasant uprisings. So they had a choice: Christian approval and religious tyranny, or civil unrest and heretical thought. They could easily be, taken over by the mob, or found guilty of crimes against the church. One of our favorite apologists, stand-up guys is Isaac Newton. They really enjoy quoting Isaac Newton. I think it's because of this quote. Atheism is so senseless and odious to mankind, it never had many professors. After Newton died, they discovered his private papers, and they found out that Newton was not a Trinitarian. He didn't believe in the worshiping Christ as a god would be like idolatry, using like what the Catholics do is with the Virgin Mary and things like that, and praying to her. It would be a fundamental sin. He didn't believe in the Trinity, and it's a view at the time would have gotten him killed if he was in the right place. If he was within the grasp of the Catholic Church, he would have ended up dead. What really kills me is that when I hear Catholic or Christian apologists, again, quoting Newton and their church, if it wasn't for Newton's science, all his work on the Bible, on the occult, and on prophecy and that, we probably would have never have heard of him. It's only because of his scientific acumen that we do hear about Newton. At the time, most of those scientists would have known of Giordano Bruno, who was a natural philosopher, and he proposed that the stars were just distant suns, and there was actually planets around them. Of course, he was burned at the stake because of his belief, not believing in the Trinity, the divinity of Jesus, or the Virgin Mary. There is actually a very interesting article in Popular Science about Giordano Bruno where they go over his trial transcripts. And one of the things that Giordano Bruno argued was other worlds theory, the idea that other stars had other worlds, and there may actually be life on these other planets. But the other world theories was heretical and was mentioned in much of the transcripts of his trial, but he wasn't actually burned at the stake for that. But it's just interesting when they say no scientist has been burnt for their belief in science. It really looks, you could make the case that Giordano Bruno was. Another scientist burned at the stake, Michael Servetus. He was a physician who described the pulmonary circulation. Most people know, if you know anything about medicine, it's credited to this fella, William Harvey, some 100 years later, using a lot of his work to do his work and on the circulatory system and how the blood pumps around the human body. If Michael Servetus was not killed in his generation, I often wonder how much further ahead would we have been. Descartes himself, after learning of Galileo's arrest, didn't publish his masterwork, The World, as it supported heliocentrism, the idea that the planets went around the sun. Included in his teachings on philosophy, physics, and biology, the entire text was finally published in 1677, long after his death and 44 years after he wrote it. Again, when Christian apologists tell us that Christianity was at the forefront of science, no, it wasn't. It often got in the way. And of course, there's Christians that are celebrated today, such as John Calvin, Martin Luther. These gentlemen put to death scientists. They're celebrated to this day, yet they caused the deaths of scientists and the intimidation and censoring of other scientists. We'll never know how many people did not pursue scientific interests because of this tyranny. Effects have no doubt rippled into modernity, and they have. I'm sure out there today there is probably a young lady or a young man in a science class that maybe has the grand unified theory locked in their brain. Maybe they have the cure for cancer, but it'll never get out because they have parents that believe the world is 6,000 years old and that science is of the devil. In the end, and kind of the icing on the cake for Christian apologists saying that Christianity helped along, this is the Index Librorum Prohibitorium, which is the index of prohibited books. And it was started in the 9th century under different names, but it finally became the Index of Liborium Prohibitorum in 1559. It was finally abolished in 1966, and it's actually funny, one of the cardinals that said, well, why are you abolishing? And he said, well, basically there's too many damn books. The stuff that Catholics were not supposed to read spanned Greek tragedies, great operas, some of the greatest works of literature that humans have created. And it also contained a who's who of the scientific revolution. Galileo, Descartes, Bacon, Bruno, Tycho Brahe, Johannes Kepler. I put a star by Tycho Brahe because technically he was briefly put on the list, but he agreed to have his work censored by the church, so he didn't go on the list. But Kepler, Copernicus, many of these that are saying that God the Most High is responsible for their science, the church actively pushed their work aside. It kept them down. And I mean, it was not until the 1990s that the Catholic Church finally apologized for arresting Galileo and suppressing his work. What's hilarious about this book is the church in Austria, the Catholic Church in Austria, they had their own index of Library Prohibitorum, and it's a directory of banned books based on the big one in Rome. It was conceived as a resource so that people buying books and people ordering books and churches would know which books not to buy. Unfortunately, the index, which first appeared in Austria in 1754, quickly evolved into an interesting literary directory, and it was itself placed on the banned books register in 1777. They had to ban their own books because people were looking for the index to find which books to buy. But in the end, to look at our claims of the apologists, it's probably a mistake to assume modern science was born out of a reaction against medieval Christianity. I'll have to disagree. Christianity was ill-prepared to take care of the needs, the wants, and the human curiosity that we all have. And it failed, so people turned to science. The founding fathers of science were all Christian. Well, that's just horse crap. As we know, the founding fathers of science, they spanned the Indus Valley. They were in China. They were the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, and even probably some ancient Christians. And he says nothing about the founding mothers of science, people like Aspasia, a 4th century BC philosopher. Hypatia, which probably everybody has heard the name, a mathematician and astronomer Ptolemaeus, who gave us some of the founding work of how music works. But nobody can deny the effect that Christianity has had on humanity, the great art, the great buildings, or the great bloodshed. We can't understand classical European literature without some grounding or some knowledge in the Bible. But to paraphrase Hitchens, religions are born of the infancy of mankind. They're our first attempt at astronomy, they're our first attempt at medicine, and because they're our first attempt, they're also our worst. Christianity fights and fights the moral and scientific progress, and when it finally loses, it claims victory, then it plagiarizes the winner. Modern Christian apologists, in their effort to keep their religious beliefs relevant, effectively steal the reason, the science, and values of humanity and claim them as their own. And I think I've been able to show that in this short time, that in the end, the claims of the apologists are unattainable. Reason in science is not advanced not because of one religion, but it belongs to all of us, humanity. And thank you. Is there any questions at all? Yep.
Yeah, Don, I want to thank you for the presentation. I think there was the basis of a number of papers there. And Donna will know where I'm going with this already. My name's Lloyd Robertson, for those of I have not met. And I'm on the board of Humanist Canada. And one of our projects this year is to offer $8,000 in prize money, and that will be repeated in future years, that's the plan, for an essay contest, a humanist essay contest. And we're planning on doing this both in English and in French. And we're planning on doing this for secondary education, high school education, and post-secondary. So we're going to have 4 categories of contest here. But before we can do any of this, we need to establish a national committee that will, number 1, set up the criteria, number 2, get the information out to the educational institutions in their areas, and number 3, help to judge the essays we receive. I would like someone from Ham to be on that national committee. So think about it. That's my pitch for now. Thank you.
Okay, but what was the question?
Will you participate?
I'd rather write an essay and try and get the $8,000 than having to judge it. Yes.
When you talked about art, you seem to you made the comparison of art during Christian times and art during Greek times, and I agree with you. Art during Greek times was very beautiful, and I'm sure everybody would agree with that. During Christian times, yes, there was a lot of iconology, and I think people who study art might say that some people have said that some of the iconography of the Christian art looks kind of modern. And so what would you say about art today? I mean, we have made great scientific advances, so what about art? I mean, it doesn't resemble that Grecian art anymore either.
Well, I think art that you would compare to the Renaissance, that you would compare to the Greek, is more like photography for us today, depicting life's realities. In Greece, I know they realized they did a lot of gods and things like that, but they did a lot of natural-looking people, how people actually looked. As we move into medieval times, the mathematics of the art, the proportions, and trying to depict how things really were. Maybe they weren't going for that, but it looked like less of a. It looked like they forgot how to picture natural scenes, and then that's picked up again when you get to the Renaissance, where we see a lot more detail, a lot more realism.
Yeah, I think probably someone better than I could argue that it's just. I mean, I think art today is pretty weird too. So, and I think art preceded religion as well. There's cave paintings and so forth, and people think they're pretty fantastic too.
Oh, I realize that, and there's also a technological aspect to it too. But just trying to depict the scenes of life, going from what the Greeks were able to do to what we could do in medieval times, it seems to me like we lost something.
Actually, I wanted to comment as well on the art, because during the medieval period, basically there was very little freedom in art. The only contracts that artists would get would be religious types. So their field or their the scope was very narrow, and it was very religious, very similar. There was no innovation, and that's, I think, what you're getting at with the Renaissance, is that it's a back to innovation and recapturing what was, and also an acceptance of we don't have to do it the same old way. During the medieval times, it was the same art, the same way, with very little nothing happening new.
I found when I was looking for art pieces and that to put in the presentation, that in the Middle Ages you pretty much It was all Christianity or certain kings' battle scenes. That was pretty much it. That's and nothing of it was predicting, looked anything. There was no, as I said before, it seemed to me that we were missing something if we were trying to depict a story the best way we could.
Has the church ever been on the vanguard of social change?
That's a pretty broad. There are aspects of the modern United Church and Unitarians that have been right in there. Maybe not the vanguard, but pretty darn close to it. But mostly United and Unitarians, great many other Christians don't consider them Christians, so you have that. Yeah. But no, I haven't found anything where on great social change where the church has been at the vanguard. Even, I mean, people will bring up Martin Luther King and that. But he was speaking as a Christian. I don't think he brought to bear any great church to bring civil rights. He used Bible quotes, and a lot of his supporters were secular. So you have that too. I don't deny the right of people's faith to inspire them. I just don't think the church was in any big way behind any of these movements, whether they be ending slavery, the scientific revolution. Most of the time we have to fight against them. Yeah.
I'm talking about Martin Luther, the Reformation.
Well, Martin Luther, he began at the Renaissance, but his whole idea was that you could read the Bible in your own language, and but he also was very rotten to heretics, that people went against his church, and he actually opened up a can of worms. That's why we have Christianity, which is basically 2 or 3 forms of Catholicism and Coptic Christians, and then after Martin Luther and the printing press, we now have 35,000 different flavors of Christianity, everybody believing in all kinds of different things using the same book. This is why the book is not, when somebody holds it up as a book of truth, I just have to say, whose truth? You can make it say it agrees with slavery, you can make it say it's against slavery. You can actually make it say it supports Donald Trump. So it's a book that is it's lost its usefulness. Any good things we can find in it, we can find in other and a lot better books. Well, thank you very much for letting me to produce that.